What I'm going to talk about, and plus some more stuff, is what is ketogenesis? What are ketone bodies? And what causes ketogenesis? And we're going to talk about the physiology behind that stuff. And the health implications for keto diets as well as fasting. And a big part of this lecture is going to focus on insulin, because insulin is a huge component of this whole story, because this really is kind of a story. So keto history and why keto diets are used. Keto diets were developed a long time ago for childhood epilepsy and for kids that didn't respond to medications or other things that were to help them. Somebody came up with a keto diet which is extremely high in fat. Generally a keto diet for epilepsy is about 90% fat. Super hard to maintain. But for about 37% of kids that didn't respond to other therapies, it was successful. Today we've used the keto diet primarily for people who've gained weight or body fat, and so it's become this this mode of weight loss, especially since Dr. Atkins came out with his Atkins diet a number of years ago. And that really kind of kick-started the whole thing again. So why are we gaining weight? So this is the relationship between carbohydrates that we eat, insulin, which is a hormone that is released from your pancreas, and gaining weight. So when we eat carbohydrates, and we all pretty much know what carbohydrates are, and there's two types, there's simple carbohydrates and then there's more complex carbohydrates. But any kind of carbohydrate is going to stimulate insulin released from the pancreas, but especially sugar or processed carbohydrates. So anything that has gone through any kind of refinement, or that's in a can or that's in a box, typically has been processed, and that's generally what you want to try to avoid. So we get a huge insulin response. Insulin is an anabolic hormone, and what anabolic means is it's going to build something. So we have catabolic hormones that break things down in your body, but we also have anabolic hormones such as insulin that build things. And there's three things that it does predominantly. One is it takes glucose, so all those carbohydrates that you've eaten that have gone into the blood, and it stores those glucose molecules as a larger component, more complex component called glycogen, and it stores it predominantly in the skeletal muscle, and it stores it predominantly in the liver. And the liver is kind of the key organ to what we're going to talk about today. The other thing it does is it synthesizes fat. So when you overeat, especially carbohydrates and or fats, the insulin response takes the extra calories, and after it is stored as glycogen, the rest is going to be synthesized to triglycerides, which is basically body fat. So you get a storage of fat, and that's where the problem lies with weight gain and increased body fat. The other thing it does, and a lot of people don't know this, is that insulin is a very potent anabolic steroid for muscle building. So it's actually good. So people who do bodybuilding, who do steroids, will oftentimes supplement their steroids with insulin because it is also an anabolic steroid and it'll build muscle. So one natural way that bodybuilders, if they don't want to take false steroids, is you would work out and then you would take a heavy dose of some kind of sugar, like cola or something like that, where you get a big insulin response, and it does help that process. So if you're athletic and you burn a lot of calories, you don't get quite the same response with fat synthesis, fat being made in the body, as you do if you just eat it and do nothing, especially overeating. So too much fat storage can interfere with the action of hormones and insulin, which then leads to type 2 diabetes. So what happens when we have way too much fat and we start to become pre-diabetic or diabetic is that fat, which is an endocrine gland in itself, meaning it releases its own hormones, those can interfere with our regular cellular function. And when that happens, then we start to get disease processes like like diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So high-fat diet inhibits fat storage. So that's where we start to get into the ketogenic diet. If we actually eat a high-fat diet, your body responds by saying, oh, I don't need to store these fats. I've already got a bunch in my system from eating them. So there's kind of the basic principle behind ketogenic diets. Now here's a graph of an insulin response in the blood to both a starchy carbohydrate in the black dots, and I'll explain this, and then insulin response to a very sugary meal. So what you have is you have breakfast right here, and this is fasting glucose levels in your blood. So this is just how much sugar you have in your blood when you've woken up in the morning. And you eat breakfast, and you get this huge rise in sugar in your blood because you've just eaten either a starch or a sugar. And after breakfast, you get a rise in each of about the same. So the open circle is a sugary meal, and the black box is a starch. But then you see what happens is after you start to come down, so insulin rises, insulin pushes those glucose molecules into the cells either to be converted into glycogen, and then anything excess is then converted into fat. But what happens is you crash. And you can see after a sugary meal, your blood glucose comes even below what you were fasted at overnight. Whereas the starch doesn't quite get as low. So what happens here, this makes you hungry, this makes you crave more sugar, so you eat it, and look at the big spike now. There's the response to a starch in the blood for glucose, and here's the response to a sugary meal. So you get much more gain in sugar in your bloodstream than you do with a starch. But then again, look what happens again at lunch. After lunch, you crash. Again, you crash even lower. So that makes you crave more sugar. So you eat again, and you get an even bigger response in blood glucose. So you get this huge spike and drop. And this is when you get tired after a meal, because your blood glucose is now dropping because that insulin is pushing it in. So you just go up and down and up and down, and you're constantly craving sugar more and more and more, and the whole cycle just never ends. Okay, so this is one of the things that how insulin is a huge component, why ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting is really beneficial. So why a low-carb diet? So why is a low-carb keto diet good? First of all, it reduces carbs, which means you get a lower insulin response, and that's really what we want. We want a low insulin response. Carbohydrate restriction has a twofold action. Because you're not getting the insulin response, it promotes lipolysis, and lipolysis is just the breaking down of fats, meaning your body fat. So when I go into lipolysis, I need a fuel, and if I don't have carbs, I have to break down fats to get my fuel, and that's going to then become ketone bodies. And the other thing it does is it reduces lipogenesis, meaning the making of fat. So not only am I not making and storing more fat, I'm actually breaking fat down to be used as fuel. If glucose is low, say during a ketogenic diet, intermittent fasting, long duration exercise, the body has to have a fuel from something else. Typically it's going to come from fats. And we're going to get gluconeogenesis, and all that means is making glucose from some other form. Typically it's going to be either an amino acid or the glycerol portion of a triglyceride, which is a fat. Or we're going to go through ketogenesis. Okay, and I'm going to explain that here shortly. So what is ketogenesis? Ketogenesis is the synthesis or the making of ketone bodies via the breakdown of fats or ketogenic amino acids. Not all amino acids can be converted into ketones. Okay, only certain ones. And we have three ketone bodies. We have acetone on the bottom, and these are just the chemical symbols for them. We have acetone, which is the least abundant. We have acetoacetate in the middle, that's the second most abundant. And then we have beta-hydroxybutyric acid, which is the most abundant, which is most of your ketone bodies are going to come from that. Okay, or in that form, I should say. So where does ketogenesis occur? Predominantly in the liver. The liver is the most predominant place where ketone bodies are going to be produced. To some degree, it will also occur in the kidneys, but to a much larger extent. Okay, now where in the liver and where in the kidneys? We've all heard of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, remember back in our biology class, the mitochondria is the energy house or the powerhouse of the cell that makes energy for us, and that's where ketone bodies are going to be produced in the liver and in the kidneys. And the blue structures there, kind of the oval-shaped blue structures, those are mitochondria. The endoplasmic reticulum, which is another structure within the cell, that's where fat is typically made. Okay. So body fat is an important precursor for ketones. So body fat stores, the body stores fat with the help of insulin, as we know, in the form of triacylglycerol, which is the same thing as triglycerides. And then triglycerides are made of free fatty acids. So you have 3 free fatty acids, and then you have 1 glycerol molecule, and that makes up a triglyceride. So tri meaning 3, and a glycerol. This will end up becoming glucose typically. That will eventually be burned either through beta oxidation, which is the pathway that fats are burned, or will be turned into ketone bodies. So ketone production, free fatty acids and ketogenic amino acids are converted to a chemical called acetyl-CoA in the liver. Acetyl-CoA is then converted into the ketone bodies and then is transported into the blood. And then these ketones that are in the blood go to all the tissues in the body, and then the tissues, since they if there is a lack of glucose to be used, the ketones will then be used. There's never a complete lack of glucose though. You are always making some glucose because the brain, even in times of starvation, the brain still needs mostly glucose. So even when keto acids are being generated heavily during starvation, the brain is still relying on about 80% glucose from gluconeogenesis, typically from the glycerol fat breakdown or the breakdown of amino acids from muscle tissue. And I threw this in here just because I thought it was really interesting. This is a normal blood, so if you take somebody's blood and you spin it, this is what normal blood looks like. This right here is what somebody looks like who has hypercholesterolemia. Very cloudy, very waxy, not good. So some people argue that that's what a ketogenic diet may cause, and other people argue that it does not. And there's research to kind of support both. So what causes ketogenesis? Diminished glycogen stores. So most of our glycogen's in our muscle and in the liver, but the problem is in the muscle, we cannot take it from the muscle and transport it out of the muscle. It is to be used in the muscle. We don't have the enzyme that will break it down and convert it into glucose and put it into the blood. So the liver is the main area that glucose comes from. So if it's diminished, like after sleeping all night, then we have to come up with something else. So how do I get into ketogenesis? I can do some fasting, or I'm starving to death. One way. Second is to do a ketogenic diet, high fat, high protein, very low carbohydrate diet. And then the third type is to do exhaustive exercise. So when I go out and I bike a couple hours and I get home and I'm just standing in the kitchen because I'm ready to eat, I smell the presence of acetone, because I remember my mom using acetone, as a nail polish remover, and it's that smell. So I am in ketogenesis at that point. I can tell because acetone is typically blown off through the respiratory system. So I can smell my own acetone because I am in ketogenesis at that point. So that's one way. Some people can smell it. So those are the ways that you can go into ketogenesis. Ketogenesis is under hormonal control, so when we are eating and we have plenty of food, our insulin levels will go up and we will not be in ketogenesis. When we're during times of starvation or when our glycogen levels start to fall, glucagon will stimulate ketogenesis by starting to break down and release fats from fat storage sites in the form of triglycerides. So here is the ketogenic pathway, and there's a lot going on there. But basically, if you have triglycerides from the body that are then broken down into free fatty acids and glycerol, these free fatty acids are going to go to the liver, they're going to be converted into acetyl-CoA, which we talked about, and then they have a different fate. Some are going to go through full oxidation, through the beta oxidation cycle, and become carbon dioxide and water, and then others will become ketone bodies for fuel for the rest of the organs and muscles. Now, as far as types of keto diets, there are 4 traditional ketogenic diets. The first one is a fixed ratio of fats to proteins and carbohydrates, with carbohydrates being incredibly low. The traditional diet is specifically for epileptics, and like I said, it's about 90% fats with high polyunsaturated fats. Typically, it's medically supervised, very hard to sustain for a long period of time. The second type is using what are called medium chain triglycerides for a keto diet. Typically, it's medically supervised. So why you use medium chain triglycerides versus a long chain triglyceride is with a medium chain triglyceride, you actually get more energy out of a medium chain triglyceride than you do a long chain triglyceride. So when companies market medium chain triglyceride drinks, they market it because there's more energy for each triglyceride molecule than it would be for long chain fat molecules. Then there's the modified Atkins diet, which a lot of you already know. Typically, a modified Atkins, you eat no more than 20 grams of carbohydrates in a day, but I've also seen 50 grams per day, which is still pretty low. So 20 grams of carbohydrates in a day is about a piece of toast. That's it. It's low. Is it effective for weight loss? Yeah, it's effective for weight loss. But like I said, it's kind of hard to maintain. Then there's the low glycemic index diet, which is about 40 to 60 grams of carbohydrate a day. And the carbohydrates that they use are low on the glycemic index. Now, I'm going to give you my own opinion on the glycemic index. The glycemic index I don't like, and the reason I don't like it is because when they give a rating for a particular glycemic food, they use that food by itself. So what they do is if they fed you a piece of white bread, which is typically what the glycemic index is based off of, it's only you eating a piece of white bread. And we typically don't eat like that. We eat mixed foods. We throw some protein in with some fats, and we have some vegetables and things like that. So when they talk about this, they're talking about what happens when you just eat a pretzel, or what happens when you just eat a potato. And I don't like that, because that's just not really how people eat. So take that with a grain of salt. So here's the macronutrient pathway. We have glucose coming in, we have amino acids coming in, we have fats from the left coming in. Everything's getting converted to acetyl-CoA, kind of a little more watered down version of the other picture that we saw. But again, what's going to happen with the acetyl-CoA can be converted into a lot of things. Fats that can be used in the form of cellular structure, eicosanoids, which are signaling molecules, biosalts from the liver, steroid hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, things like that. So acetyl-CoA has a huge role in what the body does and what it becomes. So I'm just going to briefly discuss intermittent fasting, because intermittent fasting is really just a type of ketogenic diet. There's a reduction of total calories combined with ketosis. So when you do intermittent fasting, you try to do 24-hour periods, but there's a ton of variation. So I think Jason, who you guys know, I think he was doing a 48-hour fast. So he will be heavily into ketogenesis, and he was fine with it. He said he wasn't hungry, which is great. Most people can do a modified a modified intermittent fast. 12 to 16 hours is the window, and 16 is really kind of the minimum. 12 is really pushing the minimum limit. Typically what you do is you eat dinner, and you can have whatever you want for dinner, and then you're done for the evening. You go to bed, so if you ate at 7, you went to bed at 11, there's 3 hours. Let's say you slept for 8 more hours. 8 and 3, that's 11 hours. And then if you can power through 5 more hours to a lunch, then you've got your 16 hours. Now, a way to prolong the ketogenesis that is occurring during that intermittent fast is when you eat your next meal, whether it be brunch or lunch, don't eat carbs. Eat something else that's fatty or has more protein or a combination of both, and very, very minimal carbohydrates so that it doesn't kick you out of ketogenesis. And then go on to a regular meal for the evening. So the intermittent fasting is just more manageable because you're not really restricting your carbohydrates, which a lot of people like carbohydrates, and a ketogenic diet has been shown to be tough to do long term. More sustainable, same physiology as keto. So I am a proponent of intermittent fasting. Benefits of the keto diet and fasting. So what are the benefits? Obviously, rapid weight loss. We all know, anybody who's done it knows that you typically lose a lot of weight. Reduced hunger, and one of the reasons that we have reduced hunger on intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets is because we don't have that huge insulin response making us hungry all the time. You have a lower risk of heart disease risk factors, and I'll show you another slide that kind of explains that. There's also a lot of information that shows we have enhanced cognitive performance, memory, remembering, doing tasks is improved. And then we also have improved cognitive function, which means that the cellular portion of your brain is working better. So here's an actual picture of somebody who went through rapid weight loss through a ketogenic period. All of this yellow right here is abdominal, visceral, and subcutaneous fat. And any of the yellow around here, around the arms, legs, that's all fat. So after a ketogenic diet, this is the same person, you can see how much less yellow there is. And I don't know how long how long a period of time this took place, but you can see the difference of what's happened here. Okay, so ketogenic diets for weight loss. Okay, I'm not going to talk about fat loss yet, I'm going to talk about weight loss. And I just looked through a bunch of studies. So this particular study by Hussein took participants, some of them were on a low calorie diet, and then the other ones were on a low carbohydrate keto diet. And over the same period of time between diabetics and non-diabetics, over 24 weeks, the low calorie diet people lost 12 pounds of weight, and the ketogenic diet people lost double that weight. And that's just weight only. Okay, and weight loss again, so this particular study by Noakes, they were actually on a high protein ketogenic diet, but they were both on calorie restricted diets. Both groups were on calorie restricted, around 1,340 calories. And they both showed equal weight loss. But that was probably because of the number of calories that they were consuming, not because of necessarily the diet itself. That's why there's not really much difference. Okay, now just a couple of studies on body composition, meaning fat loss, fat and or lean muscle loss. So Hashimoto in 2006 showed a positive change in body composition, meaning fat loss, of 2 pounds in the people who were on the ketogenic diet, but the diet of the 40% carbohydrate, which really is not, that's pretty much a traditional, normal American diet. They didn't have any real change. And then Volek, this is a really interesting study. He's really well known in my field. In 2010, he showed 8 pounds of fat loss but he also showed an increase of 2.5 pounds of lean tissue gain, whether that be muscle or organ tissue. It's hard to say, but it's likely muscle tissue. And then I thought the really interesting thing was they accounted for 70% of the variability in fat loss, meaning 70% of the reason why fat was lost was because of the decrease in insulin. They didn't have that huge insulin response, and 70% of the weight loss, the fat loss, was due to that insulin not being there. Huge. That's why insulin is so important. Okay, so heart disease risk factors. So many studies show that low carbohydrate keto diet has positive effects on triglyceride levels, because those are our fuels. That's what we're going to burn and turn into ketone bodies. LDLs, the bad cholesterol, those were lowered in most studies. Glycemic control, meaning how your body relates to the glucose that it's eating, which is an interaction with insulin, that was better. Hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker for diabetes, that improved. And then you had higher HDLs, which is your good cholesterol. So most studies showed positive cardiovascular disease risk factors. But here's the catch. Almost every single study that I read, and I don't know of any long-term studies out there, these were all short-term studies. Short-term. We have no long-term data, so we really don't know what happens long-term. These may change. There's a whole group of physicians who are cardiologists that say ketogenic diets are bad and they're killing people. I looked for a lot of studies on that, and there were no good studies on that, so I don't have an answer for that. Okay, improved cognitive performance. So both endogenous, meaning the ketones that are being made within the body, and those that we might drink or eat, have been linked to better cognitive performance. So mild cognitive impairment is linked to impaired glucose metabolism. So when we start to get older and we have, troubles with our memories, things like that, there's a link between glucose and fuels in the brain not being metabolized well. And that's probably due to cellular problems. Now, mild cognitive impairment precedes Alzheimer's disease, so it's a precursor to Alzheimer's disease. Doesn't mean it's definitely you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, but there's a progression there. Exogenous medium chain triglycerides, the ones that we can drink, and fasting and ketogenic diets have been shown to improve mild cognitive impairment. Okay. The subjects, now I threw this in there just because this is an area of interest for me. Subjects negative for this gene, this ApoE4 gene, is the gene that expresses if you are homozygous for the gene, it means you have less of a chance of getting Alzheimer's, but you have the gene for it. And if you're heterozygous, you have two of those genes, and your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's is much, much higher. But these were subjects that did not have the gene. And what they showed is the people that didn't have the gene, they had better uptake of ketone bodies that improved the mild cognitive impairment. Whereas people that did have the gene, it wasn't quite as good. And then cognitive function, this is at the cellular level, what's happening at the cellular level that's being improved due to a fasting or keto diet. You have a reduction in ROS, which stands for reactive oxygen species. So a reactive oxygen species is an oxidant. We all heard of antioxidants. Well, these are the oxidants that we're trying to get rid of. And what they do is they're destructive to cells. And so we don't want them. And these diets do help that. Improved mitochondrial function. So ketone bodies, for some reason, do improve mitochondrial function. So you get better energy balance. And some things will make those cells die faster, and in the brain, that's not such a good thing. But fasting and ketogenic diets have been shown to slow down that cell death. Okay. And then we have an adaptive stress response. So when you put yourself under the stress of either being mildly starved or in a ketogenic state, it's very similar to training for the body, for the muscles. So the muscle and the hearts adapt to exercise stress. That's why we do that. The general adaptation syndrome by Cellier. Neurons adapt to those mild stress of the low calories and the ketogenic diets. And so it improves the function of those neurons. Okay. And then it stimulates neurotranscription factors. And neurotranscription factors are important because they're telling the cell how to change something for either the better or for the worse. So we've all heard of genetics and how we propagate some trait to our progeny. Well, transcription factors are at the cellular level, and that's how things change in the cell. So when you're under a stress of fasting or ketogenic diets, we actually get positive effects of the DNA that is being transcribed in those cells for positive things. Like some of them help reduce apoptosis or cell death. Some of them might say, oh, we're in a state of starvation, we need to change how we react to insulin. It's just an example, but it's a good positive thing. So what are the brass tacks of all this information? First of all, what's most important? Is weight loss most important for you? Because that's why most people do it. Is health most important for you? Well, we all, I think, would agree that health is the most important, but we can achieve both. We can achieve weight loss and we can achieve health, because if you are leaner, you are typically more healthy. So how do we do that? First, your diet must be healthy. And a ketogenic diet, I would argue, even though you are losing weight and there are definite benefits of it, is not necessarily the healthiest diet in the world, because it typically lacks fiber, vegetables, and fruits, and those, as we know, are good for us. Second, it must be sustainable. And lastly, it must be satisfying, and if it is not satisfying, it is not going to be sustainable. And ketogenic diets, I would say, are not satisfying, and therefore they are not sustainable, because I don't know anybody here that has stayed on a ketogenic diet forever, even for years. They always kick out and kick in. You're on a ketogenic diet, right?
I've gone in 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
And you adapted?
But yeah, but I did use, you were saying something about fiber and vegetables. I didn't do fruits, but I did fiber and vegetables.
You did fiber and vegetables, and that would be a healthier ketogenic diet. So keto diet should be short term, in my opinion, that's my opinion, to kickstart weight loss. And, like some people, they can go in and out. I'm going to go on it for a while and I'm going to kick off it again. And that's probably okay. Intermittent fasting, in my opinion, is better because it's the same thing, you get the same results, and it's much more doable because you're not restricting the types of foods that you're eating. Although you should always restrict processed foods. So choose wisely, maximize your vegetable intake, reduce your refined sugars, like I said, and processed foods as well as trans fats. Eat whole foods that are close to the natural source. So if you grow a garden, eat the things in your garden, right out of your garden. Don't drink your calories, because you can drink your calories very, very quickly compared to eating your calories. Eat a variety of food and plan ahead. If you have trouble with, I'm just going to go get something quick to eat at this place or that place. To be successful in managing your food and how you eat, you have to plan ahead. And that is a very, very hard thing for people to do. So what are some examples of good foods? Lean pasture-raised meats, whole grains and rices, vegetables, legumes such as beans, peas, things like that. Anything low fat, low sugar. Fish is very good. Fresh fruit, olive oil, avocados. Those are just some examples. And then please check us out at Utah Fitness Institute at these social media outlets.